I think everyone has heard the story of the Trojan horse. I want to remind you just really briefly of where we're at right now, because David has had three really close encounters. One was in the caves of En-Gedi, where Saul was trying to find him to kill him. And Saul even went into the cave where he and all his men were hiding and went number two. And then David snuck and cut off an area or the corner of his robe and went out and said, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't." And Saul probably remembered when he fell on his knees and was begging Samuel not to tear the kingdom from him when he was disobedient. And Saul actually tore off a piece of Samuel's robe. And now there is David holding a piece of his robe. And he's like, "Oh man, it's all true." And so Saul repents. Then Saul kind of goes back on it. But in the interim, in the meantime, there's this Nabal story where this foolish, rich man is really mean to David, and David is about to take matters into his own hands. But then Nabal is struck dead after his wife Abigail intercedes. And he realizes, okay, like, God is in control. I don't need to take matters into my own hands, which helped him when Saul came back and was like, "I'm trying to kill you." And so David actually went into the camp when they were sleeping, and they were sleeping very heavily because God made them sleep very heavily. And he had an opportunity to kill Saul. All of his men wanted him to. But instead he realized, no. If I'm going to be king, it will be because God put me there, not because I put myself there. And so he doesn't do it. Instead, he uses that again as an opportunity to say, "Saul, what are you doing? Why are you chasing me? Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't." And Saul again repents. So there's these three really quick times, and not mentioning all the other times that God was involved in his life, like the slaying of Goliath, and just throughout his life escaping people. God is always delivering David. And I want to tell you really quickly kind of the story of the Trojan horse, because it's going to mean something when we think about this story. It happened in the 12th to 13th century BC. So we're talking a long, long time ago. And what's interesting is that the people who were talking about this was mostly one guy from the Iliad or the Odyssey during the Trojan War. And the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by a guy named Homer, actually only the Odyssey at the very end just mentions the Trojan horse. The Iliad doesn't even mention it during this war. It's actually this thing called the Aeneid by a guy named Virgil. He talks about the Trojan horse, and he was writing during the reign of Augustus. That's Caesar Augustus, the Augustan period. So Caesar Augustus was alive when Jesus was born. So the 12th to 13th century BC, and then here in like 24 to 12 BC. That's over 1,000 years. That's over 1,200 years. That's just around 1,300 year difference here. And yet we kind of take this as historical. And in fact, I really only know about the stories like these historically because I really, really like textual criticism, like how we got our Bible. Because the Aeneid by Virgil, like I said, was written over 1,000 years after, and yet much of it we take as historical. And some people, when they look at the Bible, they say, well, the reason we don't like to think about it as historical is because it's got these really supernatural things. And I say, have you read any history? Because the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid all have supernatural things. All of them. And all they do historically is say, well, we just think those are kind of added or fictional, but the rest is history. But when it comes to the Bible, they say, no, we got to throw all of it out. Because here it says God showed up, and since that can't happen, it's not historical. The Exodus didn't happen, this didn't happen. And yet, when you think about the number of manuscripts that we have for the Bible, so the Aeneid, we have a handful. And we're talking the actual manuscripts, hundreds or thousands of years after the actual events. For instance, the New Testament, we have actual manuscripts. Now, it was written not 1,000 years after. It was written within the first century. It was written, in some cases, in 1 Corinthians, 12 years after the events. And we have manuscripts that date to the first and second century. We're talking really, really, really old stuff, and we have thousands to compare it to. There is no other document that's even close to what we have in the Bible. It is historical, and it is true. But this story, if it's historical, this Trojan horse, we know it from one single document, the Aeneid by Virgil. But it's an interesting story. It all says that there are 30 soldiers that got into this Trojan horse because they were for 10 years trying to seize Troy. And they were sieging it, so they were surrounding it, but they had good access to resources, and it didn't work. 10 years didn't work. So they pretended to leave. They got in their ships, and they gave this sort of sacrifice, this horse, this wooden horse. 2 spies were in the head of the horse, watching out in the eyes, and there were 30 soldiers in the belly. They called it the womb. And when it was rolled in, and everyone was getting drunk and celebrating their victory, the ships sailed back, and those guys snuck out, opened the main gates, and Troy was conquered. It was conquered because they let the enemy in, and they didn't even know it. I say this because there is a subtlety there. And when we don't remember that in our own lives, there is an enemy who isn't always so brazen and big and bold, he can be very subtle in the way in which he gets to the thing that I think affects us all. It is our hearts. And the way in which culture has used this understanding of the heart is very dangerous. But I want you to see it. Because notice what David says. He's been delivered over and over and over and over again. And right here in 27, David thought to himself. The literal is, David said in his heart, one of these days, I'm going to be swept away by the hand of Saul. Was he swept away? Was he ever? Was he always delivered? Yes. But he said in his heart, one of these days, I'm going to be swept away by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. In other words, because Saul's going to get me someday, he says in his heart, I might as well just go to the enemy. Then Saul will despair of searching for me through all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. So David left and crossed over to King Achish, son of Mahoach of Gath, accompanied by his 600 men. David settled with Achish in Gath, along with his men and their families. David had with him his 2 wives, Ahinoam, the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the Carmelite, Nabal's widow. When Saul learned that David had fled to Gath and did not mount a new search for him, when Saul learned that David had fled to Gath, he did not mount a new search for him. So he was right. Saul didn't follow him anymore because David was with the enemy. David said to Achish, I have found favor with you. Let me be given a place in one of the country towns so that I can live there. Why should your servants settle in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag on that day. For that reason, Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah until this very day. The length of time that David lived in the Philistine countryside was 1 year and 4 months. Then David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. They had been living in that land for a long time, from the approach to Shur as far as the land of Egypt. When David would attack a district, he would leave neither man nor woman alive. He would take sheep, cattle, donkeys, camels, and clothing, and would then go back to Achish. When Achish would ask, "Where did you raid today?" David would say, "The Negev of Judah." In other words, he made it sound like he was killing his own people of Israel. Or the Negev of Jarmil, or the Negev of the Kenites. Neither man nor woman would David leave alive so as to bring them back to Gath. He was thinking, this way they can't tell on us, saying, "This is what David did." Such was his practice the entire time. Remember, he was there 1 year and 4 months that he lived in that country of the Philistines. So Achish trusted David, thinking to himself, he's really hated among his own people in Israel. From now on, he will be my servant. All of this, David going to the enemy land and making it appear at the very least that he was killing his own people, living with the enemy, endearing himself to the enemy. All of this started for a whole 1 year and 4 months of him killing every man and woman in villages so they didn't tattle on him. It all started because he said in his heart, Saul will certainly get me someday. See, but Saul, all the times before, never did because God delivered him. And yet he got discouraged. I know, and I know all of you know what it is to be discouraged. See, David said in his heart, here is the pervasive, pernicious lie of culture. Follow your heart. That is a lie. You don't follow your heart. How many times has your heart lied to you? I played this game one time. It's called Mafia. Anyone play that game before? It's a little card game. You're like a hidden mafia character. And so you hand out a card, and if you're a king or jack or something like that, then you're the mafia, and nobody knows. And there's one other person, and you kind of are trying to eliminate all the village people, and the detectives are trying to find you, and the village people are voting like, I don't know, I think that guy's mafia or whatever, and you want to be sort of the last to survive. Well, I was playing with my very good friend Anthony. He has a wife. Her name is Christine, and she was there, and she and I were I had her wrapped around my finger, like, hey, we're in this together. You know, we're in it to the end. One of these people, they're mafia. Of course, I was mafia. And I was like, we got to stick together because he's fishy. She's like, yeah, I think so too. I was like, I think we got to go for him, And she stuck with me to the end. And then when she found out, after I'd won the game, that I was mafia, she never trusted me again in that game, ever. I'd be like, I am the detective. I am. I could show her my card and she'd be like, you switched it somehow, you right? No, she never believed me. In fact, after that moment, you can ask my wife, whenever I played with anybody in that group, I was always the first one eliminated, no matter what. It's like, we just don't know, so we're just gonna get you off immediately. With that group, I've never played more than one round. I'm like, can I just sit out because I'm going to get eliminated first thing? Like, no, come on, play. It's like, fine. And then they eliminate me first thing. Like, we just can't trust you. But how many times does your heart need to lie to you before you catch on? How many times does your heart want you to be drawn to things or go to things that aren't good for you, that are bad for you, before you say, you know what? Maybe there's something better to follow. Or how about someone better to follow? The heart, it says in Jeremiah 17:9, This is the ESV. It says this: the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? The heart is deceitful. Man, there are things that I have wanted that I recognize are not good. I mean, if you're in a relationship long enough, there's going to be times where your spouse will say things or do things that make you want to say or do things that aren't good. Like you might want to say, in your heart saying, you'll feel better if you say this. And then you say it and you're like, please come back. Please, that was not a good thing to say. And then my wife just flops down and starts crying. I'm like, I feel good, don't I? Because I thought, my heart was like, be mean here. Be mean. That'll help. And it didn't. That was dumb. But I listened. The subtlety of the heart is that you can say things and in your heart all the time that aren't good, that aren't healthy, that are a demonstration that the heart is both deceitful and sick. Who can understand it? And so I think we need to recognize that all of this downfall started with I don't know where to stand here, but I think it's just going to be creaky. But all of this started with the subtlety of him saying in his heart something that wasn't true, and then he believed it. Certainly Saul will catch me one day. It's better for me to go and stay with the enemy, because then Saul won't follow me. That was true. That was true. I have found something in my life, the moment, my wife knows this better than anybody else, the moment that I started taking ministry seriously, I invited a very serious enemy. Why? Why would Satan waste his time on people who are getting it wrong already? See, the reality is that when David was where the enemy wanted him, the enemy no longer pursued him. David went and stayed with the Philistines. Who in Israel would be like, I still like David? You went to the wrong team. You went to the enemy where they are taking and killing our children, and you're staying there and endearing yourself to them. It's not like they're like, I'm still rooting for David. They'd be like, excuse me? Saul realized that David was going to a place where he'd be hated and said, that's what I wanted. I wanted them to love me the more than they loved you. That's all I wanted. Thank you. I don't want them to sing, Saul killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands. No. More. Give me more. Oh, David went and staying with the Philistines? Okay. I don't care anymore. See, the enemy is the same way. The moment you start taking your faith seriously, you have invited a serious enemy. Now, the thing is, Jesus had told this in a parable that we often misunderstand. And that parable is the parable of the mustard seed. It tells us in both Matthew and Luke. And he says it's interesting because David had just before told us about a parable called the parable of the sower. And he explained it for his disciples. If you don't know this, Jesus would tell parables, and then he would often just say, figure it out. But this one, his disciples said, we don't understand. And so he said, let me explain to you. And in explaining the parable of the sower, he talks about how the birds are the enemy that come up and eat the seeds. Well, just a little bit later, he talks about the parable of the mustard seed. He says, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that a man takes and plants in his own garden. And that grows into a tree, and birds come and nest in its branches. See, Many people have said, that means that faith, it starts so small and then it grows to something big and it's beautiful, like a beautiful tree and, chirping birds. But remember, these are farmers. And he says, the kingdom of God's like a mustard seed. They're like, I hate mustard. Mustard's a weed. It germinates super quickly and it takes over your garden. You're not like, I want dandelions or blackberry bushes in my garden, right? You don't do that. And so telling a farmer, it's like this, that doesn't make any sense. Not only that, Jewish law said you could plant one seed in your garden. One type of seed. You couldn't mix it up. So it's like the mustard seed. It's like, could we do something else? How about wheat? How about something we can use? No, it's like the mustard seed. And then it grows into a tree. They don't want trees in their garden because it overshadows everything else. And then even worse, and then birds come. Like, what? We try to get birds out of our gardens, not into our gardens. And he'd already explained that the birds were the enemy. And what happens when you plant that kingdom seed in your life? Birds come and nest in your branches. See, when you say, I've got a serious faith, it will grow. It'll take over your garden, and you have now invited a very serious enemy into your life. The enemy gave up because David gave up. The enemy is not pursuing David because David is not pursuing God. In our own lives, if everything is awesome, as the Lego man says, if everything is awesome, you ought to be wondering, man, what's going on in my life right now? What's going on? This discouragement, I know that voice. I know it. And what's really cool is I know God's voice too. And it's not that one. See, David is forgetting in this moment what God sounds like. And he's listening to that voice of his heart that is deceitful and sick, and he's following it. Worst of all, he thinks he's right. Don't we live in a culture where people follow their heart and think they're right? But in the end, it is not good. It is not healthy. It is not satisfying, and it will not last. Isaiah 41:10 says this, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be frightened, for I am your God. I strengthen you. Yes, I help you. Yes, I uphold you with my saving right hand. He should have been listening to God, but he was listening to that subtle voice of discouragement. There's this subtlety of discouragement. And like I said, I think everyone here has been discouraged. And what can happen with discouragement is that it anchors you in a place that you don't belong. It prevents you from even moving sometimes. It says, I am so discouraged that I don't want to even start. I don't want to do this or that. I don't want to move in that direction because you're just so weighed down by this sense of inadequacy, by this sense that it won't matter. I've said before, and I come up every week anyways, that the first voice I'm going to hear, even when I exit today, is going to be like, none of that mattered. It doesn't, honestly, but that's not God. It's not God. And if I let that work, you know what it's going to do? It's going to anchor me in a place I don't belong. I need to recognize that, one, it's not about me, it's about God. And I'm not following my heart, I'm following God. And we need to be in that same vein, pursuing God in all things. And worst of all, as what you saw this, is that David went to the Philistines. Do you remember who he brought? He brought 600 men. Sometimes we forget that we don't stand or operate alone in this world. I think about, like, if I just give up, what I just say, you know what, I'm done. I'm going to stay in my room all day and lay on my stomach. It's kind of my go-to, right? I'm not just hurting me. I'm hurting the people who trust me. I'm certainly hurting my wife. I'm hurting my son. I don't stand alone. It's been said in psychological circles that hurt people, discouraged people, will misled people, mislead people. And as you can see, David is a misled person misleading people because he decided to follow his heart, and the people who were following him followed. They were being misled because David was misled. And we have to recognize that in our decisions, the things that we do, if we make bad decisions, it often doesn't just affect us. Really interesting. I tell this in one of my classes when we talk about the history, but in 1463, a really big event happened. You probably don't know. It was the fall of Constantinople. That's the Byzantine Empire. That is when it was Eastern Rome. It was a really big deal, but there was a big and upcoming threat called the Ottoman Empire, and they were sieging this wonderful city of Constantinople that had fought them off pretty easily for a long time. And it didn't look like the Ottoman Empire was going to be able to breach the walls of Constantinople. It was too strong. Well, the thing is, they didn't breach the walls. One guy, when he was going through the gate, it was a gate on the side, it was a small gate. He forgot to lock it. He forgot to lock a gate. This is true. And so in Constantinople, they lost the entire city because one guy was like, like your wife is, did I turn off the oven? One guy was like, did I lock that? Yeah, I probably did. And they snuck in, opened the main gate, and then everyone was killed. Constantinople fell because just one guy forgot to lock the gate. Like your mistakes, affect other people around you. So when you are listening to the wrong voice in you, when you are misled, you can mislead other people. It's why, when I officiate weddings, what I love is the idea of a new Christian household coming into existence. Because we need beacons, we need foundations, we need people who are leading for Christ in this world as a solid foundation. But that is a tremendous responsibility because you need to be leading. And you need to recognize that the children in your life will be listening to you and they'll be following you. Man, my son, he looks up to me. He does. He comes and he hugs me and it's awesome. I think about a moment when I was, we were at an airport and we were heading to the East Coast to see family, and something got messed up with the airlines and they told us that our whole family couldn't go. And so my dad said, well, I'll stay behind and I'll figure it out and I'll get on another plane and go. And I was like, in that moment, it's like, I want to be like that. To say, look, I don't want anyone in my family to have to deal with the headache. So you go and I'll deal with it. I got to stay back with him because I didn't want him to be alone. And I remember the people were like, well, you can make a plane, but it's going to leave in like 10 minutes and it's on the other side of the airport. And so my dad and I are literally just running through the airport. And I remember he's holding his bag and I'm a young, strapping young man. And my dad, if you don't know, he's 95 years old. 95. Yeah, he looks good for 95, right? Just in case you didn't know that was a joke. He's not 95. Now, he's 85 years old. And well, we were running through the airport, and I remember him holding his bag, and he was getting tired. My dad, by the way, he could destroy me in a swimming pool. But like running, I ran at the time I could do it. I remember holding his bag, taking his bag and holding him and helping him go that way. Because I realized, my dad has been such a tremendous leader in our lives, and even that willingness to just say, you go and I'll be the one who has to deal with the headache. I want to be like that. I want to be able to sacrifice for the people in my life whom I love. I want to be able to give of myself for the sake of other people, and I want my son to witness that in me. And I recognize as I make mistakes that my son will make those mistakes too sometimes if I don't correct it. If I don't go and I say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. There are things that I recognize that my son does, and I say, oof, I put that there. That one's on me. Because we don't stand in isolation. Our mistakes are not so internalized that it does not affect anyone around you. It hurts other people. Mislead people. I mean, the other one, probably the famous one that you all know is in 1876, Lieutenant Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. I only know this because my parents got me these little army soldiers back in the day, which was, you're not allowed to say it now, but Indians, right? So they were Native Americans, but we called it cowboys and Indians back in the day. And I had the ones, and it was a set for the Battle of Little Bighorn. And it's an interesting thing because he didn't listen. And so he took all of his men into a battle in which he was it was the Sioux War, and he was overwhelmed by Native Americans and absolutely destroyed. Every single person destroyed in this battle. All because this one guy said, I think we could do it. I think we can make this work. And his poor decision led to the death of his entire brigade. Galatians 6:9 says this, so we must not grow weary of doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not give up. Can you see here that David was weary? He was weary because God always delivered him, but it wasn't in his timing, it was in God's timing. And sometimes God's timing is like in the nick of time. So when David is writing in the Psalms, he'll say, I look to the mountains where my help comes from. Because there's this idea that at like the 11th hour, at the last second, when you're like, I'm going to lose, I have nothing, I can't do it. And then over the mountains, just like, there it comes. The help, like at the last second, there it is. But man, isn't that taxing? It's really exhausting to just feel like it's like, that was close. That was close. That one was really close. I feel like it's going to get me at some point. I feel like it's going to collapse. It's going to happen. But God is always showing up, and he's always doing it. And he's teaching David how to trust when it is difficult. Yet he grew weary. He grew weary of this trust and discouraged in his heart. And so he said in his heart a lie that he believed. And it led to his downfall. 2 Thessalonians 3:13, but you, brothers and sisters, do not grow weary in doing what is right. Hebrews 12:3, think of him who endured such opposition against himself by sinners, so that you may not grow weary in your souls and give up. See that idea of growing weary? Paul says it a lot. Don't grow weary, don't grow weary, don't grow weary. There's this idea that, over time, as we trust that we can give up. It's why the Bible calls us living sacrifices. Because a dead one doesn't move. But a living one at any time can crawl off the altar if it wants to. We have to live this out. It's not a one and done, okay, I said the special magic words, I'm good now and I don't have to try. I don't have to do anything. Trust is persistent and continued. I hope you realize, because David is said to be a man after God's own heart, but man, he's killing women and children here. He's killing everybody in these villages so nobody tells on him. This is really bad. Really, really bad. I hope you recognize that the Bible doesn't give any perfect person to follow other than Jesus. So if you're like, I'm like David, yeah, you are. All the bad stuff too. Sometimes you're like, I conquered that giant. And other times you're like, I'm going to do the wrong thing because I'm so discouraged. We are kind of like David, where we can be back and forth. Sometimes we are just on it. And other times, maybe we let discouragement win and we get stuck and anchored again in a place we don't belong. So, if this all started with discouragement, that subtlety, that Trojan horse that got in there, pushed him in a direction he didn't belong, and we recognize the consequences are that it hurts other people around us. It does hurt us, of course it does, but it also hurts the people around us that we love. I think everyone can give you examples of people in your life that because of the decisions they're making really hurt you. Maybe they're making hard ones and it's so really hard on you. I've got loved ones in my life that in my wife's side of the family, my side of the family, that it's just really hard, right? There's been, suicide in the family, and it's like you have sort of escaped your problems only to give so many people around you new ones. And so, how do we overcome discouragement? How do we beat that? Everyone will be discouraged at times. And it is not something that I can say, look, you just go around it so it never happens. Discouragement is something you go through. How do you act and what do you do when you are discouraged? Because giving up and giving in is not the solution. Following your heart when it is lying to you is not the solution. I want to tell you about a guy, his name's Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian Kolbe is a very famous story. He was a Polish Franciscan monk. And because of his opposition to the Nazi regime, the Gestapo came after they invaded Poland, and they took him and they sent him to Auschwitz, which is an internment camp that had the highest mortality rate for people in it. And one day, he would, by the way, Maximilian Kolbe would give up his food and often try to help people who were starving. He would lead people in songs, and he would lead people even to Jesus. He was a guy who, even in this internment camp, was living out his faith to the people there. And one day, a prisoner had escaped. And so they wanted to make sure that they made an example of what happened. See, that person's escape is going to have consequences that affect other people. So they took 10 people at random, and they said, we're going to take all of these 10 people, put them into a room, and not feed them until they die. That's what happens if somebody escapes. So that means if anyone in this camp ever decides to escape, recognize that you're killing 10 people. That's what we want you to hear. So there was Frankiszek Gajowniczek, who was there, and he fell to his knees, and he said, no, please, I have a family. Please, please, please. And he didn't have the best German, but he said, Maximilian Kolbe said, take me. And he's like, what do you mean? He said, he has a family, and I do not. Take me. And they did it. You know why we know this story? Because of Frankiszek Gajowniczek. He did survive, and he tells this story of Maximilian Kolbe willingly going to starvation so that he wouldn't die. And what's really cool is that now, it would be so easy to be in a room of 10 men and be really discouraged. And yet they would sing in there. They would go and they would be led in discussions about Jesus. And the only person left alive at the end was Maximilian Kolbe. And he stood there defiant in the name of Jesus. And so instead of waiting, they killed him by lethal injection on August 20th, 1941. Yeah. And I think, like, we forget sometimes that these stories are real. Like, that was a real man doing a real thing for real people. And it would be easy to never raise your hand because the whole situation is just so discouraging. To be surrounded and entrapped, to be starved and to be beaten. And yet in the midst of it, to say, I'll die for him because he's got a family and I don't. And then in a room of 10 men to say, I won't give up. I'll pray for you till I die. And he did. In the same way that we recognize that this story is real, the story of Christ on the cross is real. It really happened. And we have to recognize that there were real hands with real piercings, real feet with real holes. A real man who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he did it for you. A leader. I wish, there are many times in my life, I wish that I didn't just teach people to know about God. I wish I taught them to know him because it is real. We have a real God who really saves, who really loves, who wants real relationship with us. This is real. And when we recognize, honestly, because I know my wife is real and I know my son is real, no amount of discouragement will prevent me from fighting for them. No amount of discouragement will prevent me from doing what is right and what is good and what is honorable for them. I'll die for them. But even more difficult than that, I promise I will live for them. I will live, I will breathe, I will work for them because they're real. Christ is real. His beautiful eternal glory in heaven is real. Yeah, at times you will be discouraged. What then will you do? Will you give up and will you give in? Or will you remember that Christ is real? That Jesus is real in our lives, his power is real, and we can have victory in his name because it is real. He really died and he really rose. And because it is real, we can really overcome. We can overcome. That doesn't mean that we go around and we avoid. It means we win. That we face and we conquer. Because Christ conquered it all already. And I want us to reckon, because there are beautiful stories in the world. And sometimes we forget Maximilian Kolbe had a face. Maximilian Kolbe had a heart and he had feelings and he had a mind at work. It was real. It was all real. And we can distance ourselves so much from the story that we forget just how real it is. Christ is as real as Tim here in the front row is real, which means it ought to have real impact on our lives. I want to leave you with some scripture here. John 14:27 says this, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give it to you as the world does. Do not let your hearts be distressed or lacking in courage. Notice this. Do not let your hearts be distressed. You can let your heart be distressed or not. You can let it. You can let it win. 2 Corinthians 4:8-9. We are experiencing trouble on every side, but are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are knocked down, but not destroyed. We are a lot of things, but we are victors in Christ. Philippians 4:13 says, I am able to do all things through the one who strengthens me. David got discouraged, and he forgot that nothing is impossible for an all-powerful, wonderful God. And let's not be like David, letting the subtlety of discouragement anchor us in places we don't belong. Why? Because misled people mislead people. It hurts us, it hurts others. And more than anything, remember that you can overcome because Christ did already. Let me pray that. Lord, thank you so much that you are an awesome, wonderful God. I pray that we would be people who remember that you are real and you have real impact in our lives. Thank you for your wonderful, awesome sacrifice for our sake. God, I pray that we would be people who trust you far more than we trust our hearts, who trust your will and way far more than we do that voice inside of us that often misleads us, God. I pray that we would be people who lead for your will and your way. We would be people who, in the face of discouragement, remember that you are real and powerful in our lives, and that while we may be crushed, we are not abandoned. Lord, we thank you for your presence and power in our lives. We thank you that you are a good, good Father, and we thank you that you do take care of us. And I pray that we would relinquish the things that prevent us from falling totally into your hands. We love you in your precious name. Amen.